480 BCE, as storm clouds gathered across the Aegean and Persian banners loomed on the eastern horizon, one man climbed alone into the sacred mist of Delphi. King Leonidas of Sparta was no stranger to war, but he hadn't come for tactics. He came for truth. The Oracle of Delphi, mouthpiece of Apollo, spoke in riddles as always. But this time, her words were too direct, too dangerous. Either a Spartan king must fall, or all of Greece shall burn. The priests had left. The incense still clung to the air. And that's when the real message came. In whispers not meant for council ears or temple scrolls, the oracle revealed a chilling truth. The Persians could not be stopped. Not yet. Not by force, not by walls, not even by Sparta. Greece was fractured, arrogant, disunited, and Sparta, proud and stubborn, would never act unless forced. So the oracle gave Leonidas not a prophecy, but a plan, a sacrifice. One death, his death, could light the fire that would unite a broken land. When Leonidas returned to Sparta, he told the council only what they wanted to hear, that the gods favored a stand, that Sparta must answer with valor. But he withheld the deeper truth, that this would not be a march to victory, but to myth. From that moment, every step Leonidas took led not toward triumph, but toward deliberate martyrdom, because he understood something few men ever do, that sometimes a king's greatest weapon is his death. And thus the first blade was drawn, not from a sheath, but from a whisper, not by a Persian hand, but by the tongue of the oracle. Sparta, glorious in battle, ruthless in politics. While Leonidas sharpened his resolve at Delphi, something darker stirred in the marble halls of the Gerousia, the Spartan High Council. Behind their stoic faces lay ancient bloodlines and old rivalries. Men who wore discipline like armor, but behind closed doors, schemed like merchants. Leonidas had not always been the council's choice for king. His rise had come not from diplomacy, but necessity. A warrior king in an age of delicate balance. His half-brother, Cleombrotus, still whispered ambitions to trusted ears. And among the ephors, those enigmatic keepers of law, there were those who saw Leonidas not as protector, but as provocation. As word reached Sparta that Xerxes was amassing the largest army the world had ever seen, some elders didn't flinch. Instead, they listened, carefully, to the envoys of Persia. Gold, trade, peace, all in exchange for Spartan neutrality. It was not cowardice that tempted them, it was calculation. Greece was not a nation, it was a battlefield of egos. Sparta's loyalty to a pan-Hellenic cause was anything but guaranteed. Why should Sparta die for Athens? But Leonidas, he refused such logic. He saw something the others couldn't or wouldn't, that if Persia swallowed the others, Sparta would not be spared. It would simply die last. When Leonidas returned from Delphi, the message in his eyes said more than his words ever could. But the council was unmoved. They wanted a defensive stance, fortify the isthmus, let northern Greece burn. So Leonidas offered a compromise. Not the full army, just a personal guard. 300 Spartans, all with sons to carry their names. A symbolic gesture, nothing more. The council agreed, not because they were convinced, but because they believed it was a clean solution. Let Leonidas go. Let him die. Let Sparta's hands remain unstained. What none of them expected was that Leonidas wouldn't just die well, he would die loudly. He would turn a symbolic delay into a political earthquake. In their arrogance, the council had hoped to silence a lion. Instead, they had unleashed a legend. In the story most people know, Ephialtes is a name that drips with betrayal. The deformed son of a Thessalian exile, driven by rage, rejection, and ambition, he is remembered as the man who sold out the 300 Spartans, leading the Persians through the narrow goat path that would doom them all. But history has a habit of oversimplifying villains. Ephialtes didn't grow up in Sparta. He grew up in its shadow, idolizing warriors, mimicking their drills, training alone in the mountains. When Leonidas arrived at Thermopylae, Ephialtes did what he had dreamed of for years. He offered his services, his strength, his loyalty. But Sparta was not a place of compassion. It was a place of perfection. His body disqualified him. His courage was not enough. The rejection shattered him. Or, that's the tale we've been told. Recently unearthed Persian logs written by royal scribes and forgotten in the ruins of Persepolis suggest something far more complex. They describe a mountain guide who was paid not in gold, but in passage. A man fleeing an assassination attempt, not orchestrating one. Some scholars now believe Ephialtes may not have betrayed Leonidas. He may have been running from someone else, a hidden faction within the Greek forces, a helot spy ring operating under Spartan orders, or perhaps he knew too much. Another theory? Ephialtes wasn't acting alone. He was manipulated, used as bait in a much larger scheme, a pawn sacrificed to protect the identity of a far more dangerous traitor embedded among the Greeks. The truth? Lost to the wind. But one thing remains chillingly clear. For the Persians to outflank the Spartans so precisely, someone had to lead them. And whether Ephialtes did so out of desperation or design, he didn't survive long after. Justice or cover-up, no one can say. But sometimes history needs a traitor. And when the truth is inconvenient, legends make better scapegoats than facts. The legend tells us that 300 Spartans stood alone at Thermopylae. But that is not entirely true. In truth, Leonidas was not abandoned on the cliffs. He arrived at the hot gates with an allied force of nearly 7,000 men. Thespians, Thebans, Arcadians, Corinthians, and more. A patchwork army bound together by fear and thin threads of loyalty. But as the Persian tide grew nearer and the days of skirmishes turned into whispers of encirclement, something began to unravel. One by one, contingents began to disappear. Some claim they were released by Leonidas, ordered to retreat before the pass was fully surrounded. A tactical preservation of numbers. But the records don't all agree. In fact, many surviving Greek accounts, especially those not penned in Sparta, speak of panic, fracture, and even internal sabotage. The Thebans, reportedly forced to stay, would later claim they were held under duress. The Phocians, originally tasked with guarding the secret mountain path, were caught off guard and overrun. But how did the Persians find the path so quickly? Other allies, like the Corinthians, simply vanished. No record of retreat, no evidence of fighting. Gone. Some historians believe Persian agents offered bribes or safe passage to Greek units on the verge of breaking. Others suspect Spartan arrogance fractured the alliance from within. Leonidas, unwilling to share command, may have driven key allies to desertion. But a darker theory still lingers, that a secret vote had already taken place in Sparta. A decision to let Leonidas and his small force serve as a symbolic sacrifice. A fire meant to ignite war, even if it meant snuffing out lesser allies along the way. In the end, only a few stayed. The 700 Thespians who refused to leave, a handful of Thebans, loyal or bound, and the 300 Spartans who never intended to return. The rest, gone. Erased from the myth, but not from history. Thermopylae was not just a last stand. It was a carefully orchestrated unraveling, one that raises a haunting question. Were the Spartans truly left behind? Or were they the only ones who ever intended to stay? As Leonidas rode north to meet fate at Thermopylae, the battle for Sparta's soul had already begun, far from the battlefield, behind the columns of the royal palace. Queen Gorgo, wife of Leonidas, daughter of a king, and one of the most politically astute minds in all of Lacedaemon, was never meant to rule. But when her husband marched to almost certain death, she did more than wait. She moved. Bound by law yet defiant in silence, Gorgo began a quiet war of her own. She knew what the council had done, knew they had let Leonidas go, hoping his death would end their dilemma. But Gorgo was not mourning. She was planning. While Sparta's attention was turned outward, Gorgo turned inward. She began securing alliances within the palace, among helot informants, loyal merchant houses, and even sympathetic perioikoi. She quietly tightened control over supplies, coordinated messages to other Greek cities, and most critically, began leaking the truth. She told of betrayal, of how Sparta's elite had bargained away their king, of how the true enemy might not be Persia alone, but the rot festering inside their own halls. The message was simple. Leonidas wasn't just fighting a war, he was being offered. But Gorgo didn't act alone. She turned to an unlikely source, a foreign-born advisor, long mistrusted in court circles. Some say he was a Persian defector. Others claim he was a Delphic intermediary. But Gorgo trusted him, and through him she began intercepting Persian movements across the Peloponnese. Every whisper she gathered, every deal she disrupted, delayed the Persians by days, sometimes hours. Enough time, perhaps, for Leonidas to turn Thermopylae into a legend. She could not stop the council. She could not raise an army, but she could raise doubt, and in Sparta, that was often deadlier than steel. While the king held the pass, the queen held the city. Her war had no battlefield, no banners, but it had purpose, precision, and the unshakable will of a Spartan. Among the 300 hand-picked warriors who marched with Leonidas to Thermopylae, every man had a son and a purpose, but not all of them had the same orders. Chosen not just for skill, but for legacy, the 300 were meant to be the finest, unbreakable, loyal, untouchable. But in war and in politics, loyalty is a dangerous illusion. Historians have long debated the identity of an unnamed Spartan found dead, not on the battlefield, but in the shadows of a narrow ravine. No wounds from combat, but a single puncture to the throat. At first, it was dismissed, an accident in the dark chaos of war, until fragments of a scroll surfaced centuries later in a ruined temple archive, an order bearing the mark of a Spartan effort, not to protect Leonidas, but to observe him, and if necessary, to intervene. What was the council truly afraid of? Some suggest Leonidas had gained too much favor. That martyrdom was acceptable, but defiance? That was dangerous. Others believed the assassin was not meant to kill the king, but another target among the allies, perhaps a Greek commander whose loyalty was questionable. Or perhaps the knife was held in hesitation until the final moment. What's more chilling, the idea that one of the 300 was a traitor, or that he didn't believe in the cause, but followed orders anyway? Some accounts claim Leonidas discovered the man's true orders days before the final battle, that he confronted him not with fury, but with clarity. He allowed him to stay, to choose, and when the final charge came, that man was found face down in the blood-soaked pass, side by side with his king, his dagger never drawn. A spy, a soldier, a brother, the line between them blurred by honor, fear, and fate. In the legend, they were one, but in the shadows, one held a knife meant not for Persia, but for Sparta. The Spartan warrior code was absolute. It forged boys into blades. It demanded strength, discipline, sacrifice, and above all else, no retreat, no surrender. It was said to be the heart of Sparta, a code so sacred it was whispered into ears before battle and carved into stone beside tombs. But what if that code was never truly unbreakable? Deep in the state archives of Sparta, preserved in fragments rarely studied, lies evidence that the no-retreat commandment wasn't a law. It was a symbol, one written into public lore, not private policy. Official wartime orders issued by kings and ephors include conditions, exceptions for survival, for regrouping, even for political maneuvering. So why did Leonidas and his 300 stay? Because Leonidas chose to die under the illusion of obligation, so that Sparta's legend could be born in fire, not retreat. He knew the truth, that Spartan laws, like all laws, could bend behind closed doors. But he also knew that myths don't thrive on flexibility. They need absolutes, martyrs, immovable stands. The code was more useful as a weapon of belief than as a tactical principle. It held the state together. It trained generations of warriors to fight without fear of death. And so Leonidas enforced it, not because he was bound to it, but because he needed others to believe he was. When he told his men they would not retreat, many assumed it was the code, but only a few understood the deeper reason. This was a stage, this was theater, and the blood spilled would become ink for history. The world would not remember a strategic withdrawal. It would remember the stand, the silence, the death, and the code. It was never the chain, it was the mask. She was called the Pythia, Oracle of Delphi, Voice of Apollo. Her words could shape armies, crown kings, collapse nations. But what if the oracle wasn't merely a vessel of the gods? What if she had an agenda of her own? When Leonidas entered the sacred chamber, he believed he was receiving divine counsel. But Delphi was not a sanctuary of purity. It was a center of power, carefully controlled by the Amphictyonic League, heavily influenced by bribes, foreign emissaries, even spies. Xerxes himself is said to have sent lavish gifts to the temple months before the invasion, not to ask for support, but to ensure neutrality. And yet Leonidas was told something no other king was, that only his death could save Greece. Why? Newly translated documents found near the ruins of Delphi reveal records of two prophecies delivered within the same season. One public and ambiguous, the other private and specific, not to a Greek, but to a Persian general. It warned of a fire in the mountains that must not be extinguished too soon. A cryptic line, until you place it beside Leonidas's orders to hold Thermopylae at any cost. The implication is chilling, that the oracle may have been orchestrating a controlled burn, allowing the Persians to advance but slowly, ensuring the death of a symbol to awaken the rest of Greece. Was the oracle trying to preserve Greece or manipulate it? Some scholars now argue that the oracle saw the future not through divine vision, but through political foresight. She knew that Greece, in its current fractured state, could not withstand Persia. She needed a spark, a death that would unite the warring city-states, and Leonidas, noble, stubborn, revered, was the perfect piece to sacrifice. History painted her as a mouthpiece of fate, but perhaps she was its architect, a priestess in service not to gods, but to strategy. Thermopylae, the hot gates, a narrow pass scorched by volcanic springs and bathed in legend. For centuries, the battlefield lay quiet, bones buried beneath stone, myths carved into marble. But ashes, like memory, conceal more than they reveal. In 2014, a team of archaeologists excavating a forgotten outcrop just east of the main battlefield made a chilling discovery: a sealed, fire-hardened scroll tube buried beneath collapsed stone and ash. Inside, fragments of a document bearing the seal of the Spartan royal house, marked with Leonidas's crest. Its contents: a battle plan, a confession, a legacy. In it, Leonidas speaks not as a general, but as a strategist of sacrifice. They will come, unending as the sea. We cannot stop them, but if we bleed loudly enough, Greece may wake before it is swallowed. This wasn't a desperate act of last-minute heroism. It was a design, calculated, intentional. He knew the numbers. He knew the geography. He knew they would die. And yet within that same scroll lies something more haunting. A list, not of soldiers, but of names, rival cities, council members, foreign envoys, all identified as watchers, people whose actions or silence would determine whether his death meant anything at all. Leonidas did not march to die blindly. He marched to expose, to force the hand of cowards, to make collaborators choose, and to leave behind evidence, proof of what was done and what was allowed to happen. Why was the scroll hidden? Because it wasn't meant for Sparta. It was meant for the future, for anyone willing to see beyond the marble statues and bronze masks. It shattered the illusion of a glorious last stand, revealed it instead as a message in blood, written not on parchment, but on the bodies of the brave. Beneath the ashes of legend lies the truth of a man who didn't die because he had to. He died because we had to remember. Thermopylae was never meant to be a victory. It was meant to be remembered. In the narrow mountain corridor where sea met stone, Leonidas and his 300 Spartans faced an empire, not to win, but to ignite. Their resistance lasted 3 days, an eternity when staring down death. Wave after wave, the Persian army poured into the pass, only to be turned back by bronze and blood. But the truth, the design, was never about the battle. It was about the message. Across Greece, word of the sacrifice spread like wildfire. Not just the death of soldiers, but the deliberate death of a king who chose to stay, to die publicly, visibly, symbolically. The fractured city-states, once paralyzed by rivalry and pride, began to stir. Men who would not speak to each other were now speaking of vengeance, of unity, of war. Leonidas did what no general, no council, no prophet could achieve. He made Greece remember it was one, In death, he wielded more power than most wield in life, because Sparta did not retreat, because he did not beg, because the world watched a man face the impossible and choose it. A year later, at Salamis and then at Plataea, the Greeks struck back, fierce, united, relentless. And when Persia finally fell, it was not because of strategy alone. It was because of belief, forged in the fire Leonidas lit. The last stand of the 300 wasn't an end. It was a beginning, a message carved not into stone, but into history itself. And long after the names are forgotten, the roar of that sacrifice still echoes, not in victory, but in defiance.